There was a man in Iowa who built a castle. Not a metaphor, an actual castle. Stone towers, battlements, a moat. In the middle of farm country, 40 miles from the nearest city, in a town of 2,000 people that most Americans could not find on a map. He built it because he could. Because in Ida Grove, Iowa, Byron Godberson did not ask permission for anything. He built the airport too, and the country club, and the skating rink, and the lake, a private 8-acre lake he named after his wife. On that lake, he floated a half-scale replica of the HMS Bounty, because why not? And then he built something that 50,000 people a year came from across America to witness. He built an Air Force, radio-controlled, giant scale. The most ambitious model aircraft operation this country had ever seen. Machines so large, so precisely engineered, so far beyond anything else on the market that grown men stood at the flight line with their mouths open. For a while, it felt like it would last forever. It didn't. Byron Leroy Godberson was born in 1925 in northwestern Iowa, in the kind of flat, open country where the horizon is always visible and ambition has nowhere to hide. He was not a man who moved to a city to find his future. He stayed in Ida Grove, population 2,000, seat of Ida County, surrounded by cornfields on every side, and decided that if the world would not come to him, he would build something worth coming to. In 1954, he started Midwest Industries. The company made farm equipment, which was the logical business for a man in his position. Iowa in the 1950s ran on agriculture, and anyone who could manufacture equipment that farmers needed had a guaranteed market within 50 miles in any direction. Godberson was good at it, more than good. He had what the people who worked for him described as a gut sense for engineering, not a drafting table precision, but an instinct for how things should fit together, how forces moved through materials, what a machine needed to do its job without failing. By the end of the decade, that instinct had moved him into marine equipment. He developed a boat hoist, then a full line of dock and waterfront products under the Midwest Shore Station name, then boat trailers. Each expansion followed a logic that made sense only in retrospect. A man who liked to build things finding the next thing worth building, regardless of whether it fit neatly into what he had built before. By 1973, Midwest Industries was large enough that Godberson was named Iowa Small Businessman of the Year, then National Small Businessman of the Year. The Albert Gallatin Award followed in 1974. These were not the awards of a man who had found a comfortable niche. They were the awards of a man who kept moving. What moved him next was the sky. Godberson had been a modeler, a builder of radio-controlled aircraft, for years before it became a business. In the mid-1970s, he began developing something more serious. Large-scale RC aircraft, built to a precision and a size that the existing hobby market had never attempted. The kits available at the time were competent but modest. Balsa construction, moderate dimensions, engines powerful enough to fly but not powerful enough to impress. Godberson was not interested in modest. In 1976, Byron Originals was formed as a division of Midwest Industries. 3 years later, in 1979, the first kit reached the market. It was the Pitts S-1A, a 1:3 scale replica of the legendary American biplane Aerobat, built using a material Godberson's team had developed in-house and called Byro foam. The foam was not the soft, fragile material the word suggested. It was a compressed structural foam with a hard outer surface, dense enough to hold its shape under flight loads, light enough to keep the aircraft airworthy, and, critically, capable of having covering material ironed directly onto it without melting. Wing rib detail, surface texture, panel lines, all of it molded directly into the foam parts, waiting for the builder to paint and finish. It was a different way of thinking about what a model aircraft kit could be. The Pitts also introduced the Byro drive system, a belt reduction drive that allowed the aircraft to turn scale diameter propellers at lower RPMs, matching the visual reality of the full-scale airplane far more closely than a conventional direct drive installation. For a man who cared about getting things right, this mattered. A giant-scale Pitts that sounded and looked like a toy was not what Byron Godberson had in mind. He wanted something that made people stop and stare at the flight line and ask whether what they were watching was real. The first people who flew the Pitts S-1A reported exactly that reaction. In Ida Grove, word traveled fast. Byron Godberson had done it again, found the next thing worth building, and built it better than anyone expected. The men who worked for him at Midwest Industries watched the new venture with the particular pride of a community that had learned to expect audacity from the man at the top. He had built a marine industry in a landlocked state. Now he was building an air force in a cornfield. It was, as one longtime Ida Grove resident would later put it, exactly the kind of thing Byron would do. For the moment, the kits were selling. The idea was working, and Godberson, characteristically, was already thinking about what came next. In 1981, Byron Godberson did something that no model airplane manufacturer in the history of the American hobby industry had ever attempted. He did not just sell kits, he built a world around them. Byron's Aviation Expo opened that year in Ida Grove, Iowa. The concept was simple in description and staggering in execution. A multi-day event where the aircraft that Byron Originals produced would fly in front of an audience large enough to fill a small stadium. Not a hobby shop demonstration, not a flying club meet, a full theatrical production staged on the grounds of the Ida Grove Airport, with giant-scale RC aircraft performing maneuvers that the audience had never seen at that scale, against a backdrop of full-size vintage warbirds flying cover overhead. The first year drew a crowd that surprised even Godberson. By the mid-1980s, it was drawing more than 50,000 people annually to a town of 2,000. They came from every state. They drove through the night from Missouri, from Minnesota, from both coasts. They set up tents in the fields outside of town because there were not enough motel rooms in Ida County to hold them. Local diners ran out of food by mid-morning. The Ida Grove Airport, which Godberson had built himself and later sold to the city, became for 1 week each year the busiest piece of airspace in northwestern Iowa. The show itself was unlike anything the RC world had produced. The centerpiece event was a full reenactment of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Giant-scale Japanese aircraft, played by Byron kits trimmed in period markings, sweeping low over the flight line while full-scale T-6 Texans flew overhead in formation. The runway apron in front of the crowd was flooded with water. Scale boat replicas motored across the surface. Pyrotechnics detonated in sequence. The mushroom cloud at the end of the show, a simulation of the atomic bomb that ended the war, was so large and so precisely timed that the Japanese embassy in Washington reportedly sent a letter of complaint to Godberson. He was not particularly troubled by this. The aircraft that flew at the expo were the same aircraft that appeared in Byron Originals' growing kit lineup. By the mid-1980s, that lineup had expanded far beyond the original Pitts S-1A. There were warbirds, the P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the AT-6 Texan, a B-17 Flying Fortress, a B-29 Super Fortress with a wingspan that required 2 men to carry it to the flight line. There were civilian aircraft, the Beech Staggerwing, the Waco UPF-7, the Glacier, and there were jets. The jets were where Byron Originals separated itself from every other manufacturer in the country. The F-16 Fighting Falcon kit, a ducted fan aircraft with a fiberglass fuselage, foam wings, a wingspan of 47.5 inches, and a completed length of 74.5 inches, flew on nitro-powered ducted fan units at a thrust-to-weight ratio that put it within range of genuine jet performance. The T-33 Shooting Star, designed for the same ducted fan technology, was large enough that experienced builders were already converting it to turbine power before the decade was out. These were not toys, they were engineering projects. A man who bought a Byron F-16 kit was committing months of work, hundreds of dollars in additional equipment, and a level of technical skill that separated the serious modeler from the casual one. That was precisely the point. The Byron customer was a specific kind of American. He was in his 30s or 40s. He had been building models since he was a boy, had graduated from static kits to powered flight, and had arrived at giant scale because everything smaller had stopped being enough. He drove a truck. He had a dedicated workshop. He belonged to a flying club that met on Saturday mornings at a grass strip outside town. He spent serious money on radio systems and engines and specialty tools. And he spent it without apology because this was not a pastime. It was an identity. For this man, Byron Originals was not a brand. It was a standard. A man named Gary, the kind of builder who drove 4 hours to Ida Grove every year and stayed for the full week of the expo, bought his first Byron kit in 1984. It was the Beech Staggerwing, a pre-war American classic, all graceful curves and biplane elegance. He built it over the winter at a workbench in his garage in central Illinois, following the instructions, fitting the Byrofoam parts together with a care he normally reserved for things that mattered. When it flew the following spring at his club field, 3 men walked over from the far end of the runway just to look at it up close. He drove back to Ida Grove that summer and bought 2 more boxes. He was not unusual. Across the country, in garages and basements, and spare bedrooms from the Pacific Northwest to the mid-Atlantic coast, the Byron kit boxes were stacked on shelves alongside engines and radio equipment and cans of dope and rolls of covering film. The men who built these aircraft talked about them at flying fields, wrote about them in letters to model aviation magazines, and brought their sons to the flight line on Saturday mornings to watch something that felt, for a few seconds of each flight, almost like the real thing. In Ida Grove, the castle that Godberson built stood at the center of a kingdom that nobody had planned, and everyone seemed to need. None of them knew it had already begun to fracture. The first fracture came not from a competitor, not from a foreign manufacturer, not from a shift in the market. It came from the sky above Ida Grove on a summer morning in 1991. Byron's Aviation Expo had grown into something that required a full-size airshow infrastructure to support not just RC aircraft flying at scale, but full-size vintage warbirds performing alongside them, professional aerobatic pilots contracted to fly the reenactment sequences, and pyrotechnic crews managing the Pearl Harbor finale that had become the signature moment of the entire event. The logistics were enormous, the liability was real, and on August 11, 1991, during the Pearl Harbor reenactment, a Confederate Air Force pilot named Mac Stevens Orr died when his T-6 Texan crashed during the performance. The show stopped. The crowd went silent in a way that 50,000 people rarely go silent. Godberson did not fold the expo immediately. The show moved to Ankeny, Iowa, near Des Moines in the early 1990s, transferred to a new organizing group that had the infrastructure and the airport capacity to handle what the event had become. But the transfer was also a departure. The expo in Ida Grove had been Byron Godberson's personal production, conceived, funded, and shaped by the same instinct that had built the castle and the lake and the airport. In Ankeny, it was someone else's event with Byron's name on it. The distinction mattered more than it appeared to at the time. For many longtime attendees, the Ankeny years were fine but different. The electricity that came from watching something built entirely around one man's vision, that particular quality that made the Ida Grove Expo feel like a pilgrimage rather than a trade show, had shifted. People still came. The aircraft still flew. But something in the atmosphere had changed, and the men who had been attending since the early 1980s could feel it without being able to name it precisely. Meanwhile, the kit market was beginning to move in a direction Byron Originals had not anticipated. Through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, a new category of giant-scale aircraft had begun appearing in the American hobby market, almost ready-to-fly kits, built not from foam and fiberglass in Iowa, but from pre-sheeted balsa and plywood, manufactured overseas at a cost that domestic producers could not match. These were not Byron-quality aircraft. Experienced builders knew the difference immediately. The fit was looser, the materials less precise, the engineering less refined. But they were significantly cheaper, and they were available at a level of completion that reduced the build time from months to weeks. For the serious modeler, the Gary who drove 4 hours to Ida Grove and spent a winter on a Staggerwing, cheaper and faster held no appeal. He was building because the building was the point. But the hobby market was not made only of serious modelers. It was also made of men who wanted to fly without committing to the full process, who wanted the experience of giant-scale RC without the workshop hours. That market was growing. The Byron market was not. Godberson's response, according to community accounts, was the response of a man who had always succeeded by doing things his way and had never been given strong reason to doubt that instinct. The kit line continued. The quality held. The prices reflected what it cost to design and manufacture in Iowa rather than in a factory overseas. There was no pivot toward cheaper materials, no compromise toward faster build times, no acknowledgement in the product line that the customer base was changing around it. This was not stubbornness for its own sake. It was the logic of a man who had built 50 years of success on a single principle. Build the best thing you can build, and the people who recognize quality will find you. That principle had worked for farm equipment. It had worked for marine products. It had worked for the Pitts S1A and the F-16 and the B-29. What it did not account for was a market that was beginning to value accessibility over excellence. By the mid-1990s, Byron Originals' last known catalog, dated January 1996 according to collectors who still have copies, showed a lineup that remained ambitious and largely unchanged from the peak years. The aircraft were still there, the engineering was still there, but the hobby shop walls that had once featured Byron kits alongside the engine racks and radio systems were beginning to make room for other names, other products, other promises. The kingdom was still standing, but the men who had always assumed it would stand forever were starting to ask questions that nobody at Ida Grove seemed prepared to answer. By the second half of the 1990s, the American giant-scale RC market was fracturing along a fault line that Byron Originals had not been designed to straddle. On one side, the serious builder, The man with the workshop, the flying club membership, the decades of accumulated skill. He still wanted what Byron made. He still understood what the Byrofoam construction and the fiberglass cowls and the Byrodrive reduction system represented in terms of engineering precision. He still drove to fly-ins with a truck bed full of equipment and spent his Saturday mornings at the flight line talking about airframes and engine tuning with men who had been doing the same thing since the Nixon administration. For this man, Byron Originals was irreplaceable. The problem was that this man was getting older, and not enough younger men were taking his place. The demographic pressure on giant-scale RC had been building quietly through the decade. The hobby required time, not an afternoon but a winter. It required space, not a table but a workshop. It required money, not a casual purchase but a sustained investment in engines, radio systems, fuel, replacement parts, and the tools to work with all of them. It required patience of a kind that was becoming rarer as the 1990s accelerated toward a cultural tempo that rewarded instant results over sustained craft. The manufacturers who were growing in this environment were not growing by selling more of what Byron sold. They were growing by selling something different: pre-built aircraft, foam construction, electric power systems that eliminated the noise and the mess and the mechanical complexity of nitro engines. Horizon Hobby, operating out of Champaign, Illinois, had been building its distribution network and its product portfolio through the decade with a systematic precision that Byron Originals, operating from Ida Grove as a side enterprise of a marine and farm equipment manufacturer, was not positioned to match. The ARF Wave, almost ready to fly, assembled overseas, delivered to hobby shops at a price point that domestic producers could not approach, was not a niche development. It was a structural shift. The men who might have spent a winter building a Byron Staggerwing were instead buying an imported ARF warbird that flew adequately, cost a third of the price, and was ready for the field in a weekend. Byron Originals had no answer for this. Not because the people running the company lacked intelligence, but because the company's entire identity was built on the proposition that the building process was inseparable from the product. A Byron kit was not just an aircraft. It was a winter's worth of evenings at the workbench, a set of skills acquired through patient work, a finished machine that carried the weight of everything its builder had put into it. Strip away that process and you had not made a better product. You had made a different product entirely. And Byron Originals was not in the business of making different products. The kit line went quiet. Not with an announcement, not with a press release or a final catalog or a letter to dealers explaining what was happening. According to the modelers who were paying attention in the late 1990s, the Byron kits simply became harder to find. Dealers who called to reorder were told stock was limited. Hobby shops that had carried the full lineup began showing gaps on the shelves. One model gone, then another, then the shelf space quietly allocated to something else. The last known catalog, dated January 1996, became a document that collectors would eventually seek out, the way people seek out the final issue of a magazine that has stopped publishing, not because they need it, but because it marks an ending that was never formally declared. What remained was the fuel. Byron Originals had been blending model aircraft fuel, nitro-methanol mixtures for glow engines, since the early years of the company. It was a natural complement to the kit business, a consumable product that customers needed continuously rather than once per build cycle. As the kit line faded, the fuel operation quietly became the primary business. The Byron name, which had meant giant-scale ambition and Iowa engineering precision, now appeared most prominently on cans of nitro fuel stacked in the corner of hobby shops that no longer carried Byron aircraft. The irony was not lost on the men who remembered the expo. In 1987, Byron Originals had been formally spun off from Midwest Industries as a separate company. Byron Godberson's son, Bruce, became president. The transition made structural sense. The model aviation business had grown large enough to warrant its own corporate identity, and separating it from the marine and farm equipment operations clarified the balance sheet on both sides. What it did not clarify was the question of vision. Byron Godberson Sr. had built the kit business the same way he had built everything else in Ida Grove, through personal conviction, through the particular confidence of a man who had been right often enough that doubting himself was not a reflex he had developed. The engineering decisions, the product choices, the scale of the Aviation Expo, the castle, the lake, the airport, all of it flowed from the same source. When that source was no longer directly connected to the day-to-day operation of Byron Originals, something changed that was difficult to define and impossible to replace. Bruce Godberson ran the company competently. The fuel business continued. The injection molding operation, a plastics division that had been formed to produce parts for the model aircraft kits and had since grown into a broader OEM manufacturing business, expanded to fill the space that the kit line had vacated. Byron Select, a successor entity, pushed further into custom molding and eventually into outdoor furniture and pool and spa accessories, manufacturing spa steps and leisure products under the trade name Leisure Locker. The company survived, the name survived, the building in Ida Grove survived. What did not survive was the reason any of it had started. Gary, the builder from Central Illinois who had driven 4 hours to the expo every summer since 1984, who had spent a winter on the Beech Staggerwing and another winter on the AT-6 Texan and a third winter on a Byron P-51 that he had never quite finished, noticed the change the way a man notices a season turning, not in a single moment but in the accumulation of small absences. The Byron booth at the regional fly-in that had always been stocked with new brochures showed up one year with older literature and no new kits. The hobby shop in his town that had carried the Byron line for 15 years told him on a Tuesday afternoon in the late 1990s that they were not getting restocks. He called the company directly. The man who answered the phone was polite and unhelpful, in the particular way of someone who does not have good news to deliver and has been instructed not to deliver it directly. Gary still had 2 Byron kits in their original boxes on a shelf in his workshop. He had been saving them, the way serious builders sometimes save the best bottle of wine, waiting for the right occasion. He stopped waiting for the right occasion. He understood, without being told explicitly, that there would be no more where those came from. Across the country, in garages and spare bedrooms from the Pacific Northwest to the Carolinas, other men were making the same quiet calculation. The Byron kits that appeared on early internet auction sites in the late 1990s and early 2000s sold quickly, at prices that surprised even experienced collectors. A mint-in-box World War II warbird, the P-51, the P-47, the B-17, commanded $1,500 to $2,000 from buyers who understood what they were looking at. Not the cost of a hobby purchase, the cost of a piece of something that was not coming back. In Ida Grove, the castle still stood. The lake that Godberson had named after his wife still reflected the Iowa sky. The airport he had built and sold to the city still handled light aircraft traffic in and out of Ida County. The expo grounds in Ankeny still hosted fly-ins, though the scale and the electricity of the original event had diminished to something manageable and ordinary. Byron Godberson himself was in his late 70s. He had been inducted into the Iowa Inventors Hall of Fame in 1996, recognized for more than 50 patents across a career that had moved from farm equipment to marine products to model aviation, without ever losing the thread of a man who built things, because building things was what he understood. He was still in Ida Grove. He had never left. But the kingdom he had built around the dream of giant-scale American aviation was already, by any honest measure, gone. The only question that remained was whether anyone would mark the moment when it ended. Byron Leroy Godberson died on May 11, 2003. He was 77 years old. The obituaries that ran in the Iowa papers were long and specific in the way that obituaries for genuinely consequential local figures tend to be, cataloging the farm equipment, the marine products, the 50 patents, the awards, the community contributions, the castle architecture that had given Ida Grove a skyline unlike any other small town in the American Midwest. The mayor of Ida Grove told a reporter that people used to say Orlando had Disney World and Ida Grove had Byron. The man who had worked for Godberson for 32 years said that he had a gut feeling for engineering that was as good as anyone he had ever seen. More instinct than calculation, more conviction than method. The model aviation community noted his passing in forum threads and magazine letters with the particular grief of people who had watched something irreplaceable disappear and were only now finding the language for it. Men who had attended the expo in the early 1980s, who had stood at the Ida Grove flight line watching giant-scale P-51s and B-29s and F-16s perform against an Iowa summer sky, wrote about what those weeks had meant to them with a specificity and an emotion that surprised even themselves. They were not writing about a hobby event. They were writing about a world that had existed for a brief and specific time and would not exist again. What they understood, even if they did not state it directly, was that Byron Godberson had not simply founded a company. He had been the company, its engineering instinct, its ambition, its willingness to attempt things that no reasonable business plan would have sanctioned. The Pitts S-1A in 1979, the Aviation Expo in 1981, the Pearl Harbor reenactment with 50,000 spectators and a mushroom cloud pyrotechnic finale in a cornfield in northwestern Iowa. These were not the decisions of a management team or a product committee. They were the decisions of a single man who had never learned to think small. When that man was gone, the decision stopped. The fuel business continued under the Byron Originals name. The injection molding operation continued under Byron Select. The leisure locker spa products, steps and storage units, and pool accessories manufactured from the same rotational molding technology that had once produced parts for giant-scale aircraft kits, moved steadily into a market that had nothing to do with model aviation. The Byron name appeared on packaging in pool supply stores and spa showrooms, attached to products that the 50,000 people who had once driven to Ida Grove for the Aviation Expo would not have recognized as belonging to the same company. This was not a betrayal, it was a survival. The people running the successor businesses made rational decisions with the assets they had, and the assets they had were a plastics molding capability and a fuel blending operation. Not a visionary founder with 50 patents and a conviction that giant-scale RC aviation deserved to exist at the highest possible level of ambition. In the hobby shops that were still carrying Byron fuel in the years after Godberson's death, the cans sat in the same aisle as competing nitro blends from other manufacturers. Some of the older shop owners recognized the name. Most of the younger customers did not. The connection between the Byron label on the fuel can and the Byron label on the giant-scale aircraft that had defined an era of American RC aviation was not something that a can of nitromethanol mixture communicated in any legible way. Gary drove past the Ankeny airport the summer after Godberson died. He had been going to fly-ins in that part of Iowa for 20 years. An old habit took him past the grounds where the expo had operated in its final years. There was no marker, no sign explaining what had happened there. The airport looked like any other regional airfield in the Midwest, functional, maintained, indifferent to its own history. He thought about the stagger wing he had built in the winter of 1984. About the way the Byro foam parts had fit together with a precision that had surprised him, having been conditioned by lesser kits to expect gaps and adjustments and workarounds. About the 3 men who had walked across the flight line to look at it up close on the morning of its first flight. About the workshop shelf where the last 2 Byron kits still sat in their original boxes, the cardboard faded now, the tape that sealed them beginning to yellow at the edges. He had never opened them. He still had not decided whether he would. The B-17 that Byron Godberson had built for the Aviation Expo, a giant-scale masterpiece that had flown at Ida Grove for years, surviving the shows and the transitions and the long decline, eventually found its way to the Iowa Aviation Heritage Museum at the Ankeny Regional Airport. It hangs there now from the ceiling, suspended in a permanent banking turn, as if it is still looking for the flight line that no longer exists below it. It is the largest artifact of the Byron Originals era that most people will ever see. Most people who walk underneath it do not know what they are looking at. The castle is still there. If you drive into Ida Grove, Iowa today, the castle architecture that Byron Godberson built across his hometown is the first thing that announces itself. Stone towers on the county courthouse annex, battlements on the American Legion building, medieval detailing on structures that have no logical reason to look the way they do in the middle of flat northwestern Iowa farmland. The buildings have been maintained. The town has not forgotten who built them or why. A sign at the city limits welcomes visitors to Ida Grove in lettering that carries the same architectural vocabulary as everything else Godberson left behind. Lake Lejeune is still there too, the private 8-acre lake he named after his wife, though the half-scale HMS Bounty replica that once floated on its surface is long gone. The Ida Grove Airport, which Godberson built from bare ground and later sold to the city, still handles light aircraft traffic in and out of Ida County. If you stand at the edge of the runway on a quiet morning, the Iowa sky above it is exactly as wide and blue and indifferent as it was in 1981, when the first Aviation Expo filled that same airspace with a giant-scale aircraft that 50,000 people had driven through the night to watch. Nothing that happened here is marked. There is no plaque at the flight line, no historical marker explaining what Byron's Aviation Expo was, or what it meant to the men who attended it, or what it represented in the brief and specific history of American giant-scale RC aviation. The event existed, filled the sky over this small town for a decade, and then moved away and diminished and stopped. And the ground it occupied absorbed that history the way Iowa ground absorbs everything, quietly and without ceremony. The kit lineup that Byron Originals produced between 1979 and the mid-1990s survives almost entirely in private collections. The P-51s and the P-47s and the B-17s and the giant ducted fan F-16s exist in garages and workshops and climate-controlled storage rooms across the country, owned by men who bought them new and never built them, or built them and never stopped flying them, or inherited them from fathers who had done both. On collector forums, A mint-in-box Byron Warbird still commands prices that reflect something beyond the cost of the kit itself, the particular premium that attaches to objects from a world that no longer produces them. The molds that Godberson's team used to produce the Byrofoam components and the fiberglass parts have not been publicly accounted for. Whether they were preserved, sold, warehoused, or lost in the transition from kit manufacturer to molding company is not documented in any source that the collecting community has been able to locate. For the men who would most want to know, the builders who would give serious money for the chance to run a legitimate reissue of the Byron F-16 or the Beech Staggerwing, this absence is its own kind of grief. The tooling that made those aircraft possible may still exist somewhere in Iowa, or it may not. Nobody appears to know for certain. Byron Originals Inc. still operates. It is the world's largest producer of fuel for the modeling industry, according to its own description, and it manufactures injection-molded and rotationally cast components for OEM customers across multiple industries. The website lists spa steps and pool accessories alongside its fuel products. The Byron name appears on packaging in markets that have no connection to model aviation. The company is functional, solvent, and entirely unrecognizable to anyone whose primary association with the Byron name involves a giant-scale P-51 banking over an Iowa flight line in 1987. Gary still has the 2 unopened Byron kits on the shelf in his workshop. He is in his late 60s now. The workshop has changed around them. Newer tools, different projects, the accumulated evidence of a life that kept moving after the hobby that shaped it began to change. He does not fly giant scale anymore. The club field where he spent his Saturday mornings closed when the landowner sold the property in the mid-2000s, and he never found a replacement that felt the same. He thinks sometimes about opening one of the boxes, about spending a winter on it the way he spent winters on the Staggerwing and the Texan and the unfinished P-51 that he eventually gave away. About whether his hands still remember what to do with Byrofoam and fiberglass and a building process that demands patience of a kind the world no longer particularly rewards. He has not opened them yet. In the Iowa Aviation Heritage Museum at Ankeny Regional Airport, the Byron B-17 hangs from the ceiling in its permanent banking turn. The wings are clean, the engines are still. The detail work, panel lines, turret positions, the particular shade of olive drab that Godberson's team applied to the airframe decades ago, is precise in the way that everything Byron Originals made was precise. Below it, the museum floor is quiet. Outside, the Iowa sky is exactly as wide as it always was.